He was a leader in the Free South Africa movement in the 80s and active in Black Lives Matter today. Reverend Graylan has also been a veteran of social and economic justice activist and outspoken supporter of Palestinian human rights. Recently, on September 24th of this year, he was invited by the New York chapter of Friends of Sabeel, North America, to speak about Palestine. A few days before he was going to travel to upstate New York for the talk, Reverend Hagler was disinvited. We are most grateful to have his presence with us here today to share his stories of equal rights and justice for all people, including the Palestinians. The plenary title of his speech today is Palestine and the Struggle Against Racism. Welcome, Reverend Hagler.
Well, good afternoon, y'all. Come on, y'all here, right? And I want to just thank you for the introduction, and it is good to be here. I'm so happy that I'm not disinvited from you all, but allowed to come and be a part of this conference, and always have respected the work and the topic exploration that Friends of Sabeel has continued to do throughout the country, and it's just a pleasure to be here with you all again. I just want to say a couple things as I get started. One is racism, it exists because its existence is always denied. It is always defined as something else, as classism, as just simple oversight, no slight was intended. It never exists as racism. People just don't talk about it. They feel uncomfortable talking about it. That's what people of color generally always experience, is that their feelings are always diminished and what they feel is often denied. One of the issues around Palestine is simply this, is that's one of the issues, if you notice, you can't talk about because it fits so well within the whole paradigm of white supremacy in terms of what is done to Palestinians. Now, I know when I say this, sometimes people get a little upset, but I just want to say this. And people of color, we notice very often that when we say something is racist, to the dominant culture, you got to prove that it's racist. Folks are going to say, oh, no, there you're being hypersensitive. Or there you go playing the race card. We know that. We got to prove that. Folks want to always tell us that what we see does not exist at all, such as the Confederate flag is a thing of Southern history and culture. Has nothing to do with racism, enslavement, and so we misunderstood that. Or I've been working around the Washington football team trying to change the name, and often, over and over again, folks say, well, you really don't understand that moniker is really a thing of honor. Honoring Native Americans. Even though you got Native American organization after Native American organization saying it's a despicable and racist name and it ought to be discontinued. And folks say, well, I don't see it that way at all. Or women that come along and say something is sexist. How many times are you going to hear it say, no, you really don't understand. There you go being emotional again. There you are just being hysterical. You must be your time of month. People diminish women, people diminish people of color all the time. We got to work hard to try to prove that something is offensive and that something denies our humanity. But then all of a sudden, when you talk about this subject, somebody comes along and says anti-Semitic, and all of a sudden the conversation stops. Somehow, folks don't have to prove that there is anti-Semitism. But we got to prove that it's anti-black, or we got to prove that it's anti-Latino, or we got to prove that it's anti-Arab, but somehow we don't have to prove that it's anti-Semitic. And what I'm getting at is that very often that's been designed in order to allow certain discussions to continue to take place and certain discussions to be cut down. All of it, right? So we got to continue to challenge and look at how things are just operate with a double standard. Double standards such as the Holocaust. What is the Holocaust? I always ask folks to question the narrative that is presented, because people present us with a narrative all the time and we buy into the narrative. The Holocaust, as if there was only one Holocaust that ever existed in the world. That there was only one Holocaust that only existed after World War II in Europe. And therefore, anything else that happened to anybody else is diminished by the narrative. It's not the Middle Passage, for example. It's not that. It's not the Nakba, for example. But it's always the Holocaust. Why? Because, again, other histories and other people are being diminished by the narrative that exists. The narrative has been designed to make people think one thing and to condition other people to think that they're not deserving, et cetera, et cetera. So we got this narrative that exists about Israel. We were just talking about it in a workshop, that there's all this theology that exists from Christians about the state of Israel, thinking that the biblical Israel is the state of Israel, and that somehow they're two separate things, right? That the contemporary state has no reflection whatsoever to do with the biblical Israel, but somehow in our churches we buy into this concept that that this is God's protection, and therefore we can't question it. Therefore we can't examine it. Again, it's a racist paradigm. I raise up all of this because in January 2014, we put together a delegation and went to Palestine and Israel. And it was made up a little bit differently. It was made up with some labor organizers, black, and it was all black delegation. And there were also word artists and hip-hop artists that were a part of that delegation. And so we went there in 2014 to see what was going on there in that land. And as we traveled, people kept trying to say to us and interpret for us what was going on. Now, what was interesting was that it got very apparent to people very quickly, particularly those of us as we have come out of neighborhoods and struggles and communities, and folks kept saying at a certain point, you don't need to explain that any longer to me. I understand it. I know what it means when police do jump outs in your communities. I know what it means when cops just roll up on you for no reason whatsoever and throw you up against a wall or lock you up or pretend that you did some offense. I know what it means to have no voice. I know what it means to exist in a ghetto-like existence. I know what it means. Folks understood from the very spirit of what they were seeing. And people understood that this was like Jim Crow. Some of the folks on the delegation weren't old enough to really know about Jim Crow, but I've seen it, and that's what it was and is, Jim Crow-like existence, separate from one another, and definitely not equal, right? Existing in different worlds, existing really by the influence of those who are the dominant culture, defining your reality, defining your history, defining what you can do, what you can't do, and also feeding you a narrative that basically, if you buy into it, you end up being conditioned to think of yourself as less than human, to think of yourself as deserving of what somebody else is doing to you. That's what we saw. We saw this Jim Crow, apartheid-like existence. There was no other way in which to define it. It could not be denied. It was there slapping you upside the head if you had eyes with which to see it, if you had eyes and a spirit with which to feel it. We felt the impact that was going on. Why? Because we could relate to it from a very personal point of view, a very personal spirit. I think it was about 1981. I was organizing in Boston, and it was at a time in Boston when there was great racial unrest. And it was after school desegregation, and the white community was very concerned about the black community getting out of place. And so there were attacks all over the city, people walking down the street on a Sunday afternoon, and somebody jump out of a car and attack the family. And it was so forth and so on. So I started organizing around that issue. And as we had a big demonstration one year, I was locked up along with about 50 other people, except I was seen as the troublemaker, the outside agitator who had just come into Boston. And so I found myself charged with attempted murder of a police officer, about 30 other charges. And they were going to try to get serious time. But what I'm getting at that story, if you understand what I'm saying, that's what happens to people of color when they don't stay in their place. That's what happens when people of color seem to threaten a system that exists. That's what happens when people stand up and decide that they have their own dignity and their own self-worth, and they need to define their own reality and their own future. Because the culture is set up to make sure that people remain in their place. That's what Black Lives Matter is about right now. The police are putting black folks in their place. And the young folks are saying, we ain't got no place to sit that you're going to relegate us to. Our place is what we make it. At the University of Missouri, folks stood up. Why? Because they stepped out of place to make a place and to bring about a different kind of future. I'm so glad that young folks are standing up, not only in the United States, in these places like Baltimore and these places like Ferguson and even in Minneapolis, folks are standing up, but I'm glad that young folks are standing up all over the world, including the occupied territories and the West Bank. Because sometimes, I'm going to tell you the truth, we're old heads in here by and large. Old heads sometimes can't go where young folks want to take us. Old heads have relegated themselves and allowed themselves to be conditioned by the narratives that other people have put in place. And yes, we hope for a better world, but sometimes we don't have the courage to go out and affect it. But thank God for the power and the innocence of youth that really believe you can change a world. We need to change a world, and our young folks are going to lead us. In Baltimore, Maryland, on the night of the uprising, it was so powerful to see, and I know for many it was scary, because you had young folks with bricks and rocks going up against Glocks. Young folks who said that the political leadership had let them down. Young folks who said that the religious leadership had let them down. Young folks who said that enough is enough. We're tired of being picked up and dying in the streets, and nobody's shedding a tear for us. We're going to take our destiny into our own hands. And they did it. The next day, the politicians had to circle around and try to get back in front of the young folks, because the young folks had moved out in front of the politicians saying that you're irrelevant. That's what happened in the intifadas as well. The young folks said, the politicians, you've let us down. You have not taken us where we needed to go. And so the young folks circled around and basically forced the politicians to try to get back in front of the young folks. I'm glad that young folks got the impatience to lead us where we don't want to go, to take us down the road that we're too afraid to take the journey on. God bless our young folks, and may they continue to stand up. I was young once too. But I got news for you. I'm not too cynical not to be led by my young folks. They got to take me now where I need to go. I've gone on my own. Now I'm so glad that folks have stepped up to the plate to take on the issues that we need to take on. Because what happens in this world is that we buy into this silliness, we buy into this greed, we buy into this capitalism, we buy into this idea of let's be reasonable and rational. We get all caught up in that we forget that we need to make prophetic stance. We need to confront power, and sometimes you confront power in the way power has been confronted in Ferguson and Baltimore. Sometimes that needs to happen. I know that many of us are church folk and we say, oh, but we're nonviolent. I was talking to a group the other night, and I was saying around the issue of Palestine or the issue of black folks dying, one thing about being nonviolent is that you got to have witnesses with a conscience and a desire to see. If there are no witnesses there and nobody has a desire to see, then you're just engaged in a suicidal mission by being nonviolent. You see, because it is our disengagement that forced people to the wall. It's our disengagement, our refusal to cry out that something is wrong, that forced people into engaging in desperate acts. It is our own denial that something needs to be done. It's our own apathy in dealing with our government to keep them from sending $50 billion to the state of Israel. It's our inability to change things that creates a context of desperation when the newspapers can't even tell the story fairly and justly about Palestine or about Baltimore or about Ferguson. The fact is that folks are trying to feed us something, and unfortunately we're buying into it. If you remember this, Baltimore, the papers came back, the media came back, the corporate media came back and said, call them thugs. Y'all remember that? Taking on the politicians, saying, well, why don't you call them thugs? Why don't you call them thugs? And one politician surprised the reporter from CNN as he was circling around trying to get politically back in front of the young folks. And he was being tested by this anchor person, saying, well, why don't you call them thugs? And he says, I'm not going to call them thugs. He said, why don't you just go ahead and call them what you want to call them? You want to call them niggers. And the anchor person was all of a sudden in shock. But he had hit it right on the head. Because that is what thugs mean. See, when I grew up in Baltimore, And in the papers, you could tell when a story was reported who was white and who was black. They would not tell you they were white or they're black. But whenever there was a street altercation, it would say a group of young toughs, i.e. white, or then it was black, a group of thugs, or a group of hoodlums, right? So if you can look at the language, one is you're just tough. The other one, you're a thug or you're a hoodlum. There is code language, racial code language. Racial code language like Israel is in a bad neighborhood. How many times have you heard that? What neighborhood? They must be in my neighborhood. They must be in a neighborhood. I can't say Harlem no more because that's been gentrified. Every other poor neighborhood has been gentrified. Oh, that's right. I forgot that they want to gentrify all of Palestinian territory and make it right for Israeli settlers. That's what happens. That's the paradigm. Gentrification is a nice word for displacement. Gentrification is a nice word for removal of folks and the taking over of territory. So when you hear that saying, and I've always thought that was interesting. My brother even thinks that. My brother said, what do they mean a bad neighborhood? Think about it. That's the justification for pouring billions of dollars into Israel's coffers, to protect itself in that bad neighborhood. Or settlers on the American frontier needed cavalry to protect themselves in a bad neighborhood as they took land from native folk. What I'm getting at here over and over again, we continue to see this kind of racist paradigm and code language that is used, that folks don't exactly come out and say it. But there's almost a winking and a blinking to the dominant culture and saying, we got this. Leave it alone, we got this, don't meddle in it, et cetera, et cetera. So as we traveled around, we saw this racist dynamic. We saw Israel being a bad player. We understood already how U.S. police have been trained in Israel. In fact, Chief Ramsey, who was in D.C., who's now in Philadelphia. Where's the Philadelphia brother? They're in Philadelphia, right there. Right. In Philadelphia, he took all the folks to Israel to go in and go to a seminar with the IDF, and they came back and they decided that one of the acts they were going to do was going to turn on the blue flashes on the top of the cars. And so they came back, and there were so many accidents that week because everybody felt that they were being pulled over. Nobody knew what was going on, right? The fact is that they also brought and put in place all types of weaponry that had come off the battlefields in places like Afghanistan, off the battlefields in places like Iraq. And you know, when you get that weaponry, you're not getting it to keep it on a shelf. to look at it in a case. You're getting it out of hopes to use it one day. That's just the way it is, right? And so as we've seen not only the militarization of the police departments all across urban areas, but we also witnessed not only the militarization of it, but we witnessed the training of it if you're trained by the IDF, you're trained in occupation. And so it's no stretch of the imagination that folks are coming into the community in a spirit and a mentality of occupying the community, of carrying out the tactics of occupation. And one of the tactics of occupation is, as they say, to make your presence known. And what does that mean? That means you keep people off guard. You enforce what you can enforce violently, severely, roughly. You do that so that people understand that they got no power in the situation, that they're nobody in the situation, that they don't have a voice in the situation, that those who are wearing the uniforms and got the guns, they got all the power, they define the reality, they define the history. That's what not only is going on in the West Bank, the occupied territories, in Gaza, not in Gaza, but around Gaza, but that's what's going on, and that's what's going on here in the United States of America. I always look at racism as an international phenomenon, not localized, not just black and white, but white and people of color versus people of color. Because it's applied in that way. We can call it colonialism if we want. We can call it neocolonialism if we want. We can call it a whole lot of things. It still comes down to a white supremacist paradigm being applied and exercised all over the world. In the United States, in Latin America, on the African continent, in the Middle East. That is what exists. And so when we engage in this anti-racist work at home, we got to realize that we engage in that anti-racist work abroad. We have to be as present on all these issues as we are present at home. And one of the things, I heard somebody ask a question earlier in terms of if you work on all these different issues, don't you begin, in a sense, to weaken your focus? That's an interesting question, since people of color don't have that choice. We got to work on this and this and this and this and this at the same time. When I get up in the morning, I'm not only dealing with church stuff, but one time I'm, like just this week, with workers out at National Airport trying to get them a fair wage. And then I'm over with these folks over dealing with the issue of Palestine. And then I'm across town trying to deal with another issue of folks having to face the cops. All in one day, all in 1 week. So we wake up and we realize, and I've realized since I've grown up, that racism and the paradigms of white supremacy is something that we had better deal with wherever it rears its ugly head, because it's like a cancer. It'll eventually come to you even if you think that you're safe. It'll come to your community. Everybody of color knows that. Right? They know that they're not safe, even if you're in a nice little secluded neighborhood, feeling mighty comfortable that you've made it, that you've broken into a place. Well, I shouldn't say breaking into a place, because that's what the cops always say, is that if you're in the wrong neighborhood, that you broke into it. Am I right? Right? But again, it's sort of like we get comfortable, and sometimes we think that we don't have to deal with those issues any longer. And then something happens, like you get up in the evening as a person of color, and you go to put the trash out, and the next thing you know, you're surrounded by cops because they've decided that you're in the wrong neighborhood. They decided you don't fit in. Racial profiling. Racial profiling that exists at home. Racial profiling that exists in Palestine. Racial profiling that exists in Israel. As we were traveling around, we heard that some Africans had broken out and were marching. This was January 2014. We caught up with them. And there were thousands of brothers and sisters, I must point out, from the Sudan, from other places. And again, the issue in Israel was these weren't considered refugees. The political language that they were applying to these Africans was that they were infiltrators. Infiltrators is a military term. They use that term deliberately to refer to them as infiltrators, simply because if you refer to them as refugees, then at least they would be afforded some arguable rights under international law. But if you say that they're infiltrators, they don't deserve any rights whatsoever. And in fact, they've been put into forced labor camps as they await deportation. That, again, is another racist paradox, because it reminds me of what? It reminds me of the argument of 3/5 of a human being. Because they argued 3/5 of a human being because the southern states wanted to be able to count slaves so that they can have greater representation in Congress. But they could not count slaves as a full human being, because that would suggest, therefore, whether you can hold a full human being in slavery, and whether that full human being should be free. So they said 3/5 of a human being so that they would not be fully human, but it would also benefit us in terms of what we need in representation. That's what forced labor camps in Israel is about, when you're dealing with people that you call infiltrators and not refugees. We got this international problem and this history that we got to deal with. I focus on this as I come out here to this community, to this conference, and realize that out of all the steps forward we have taken, particularly around the issues of race, we've taken some tremendous steps backwards. We've seen as a backlash of electing a black president the proliferation of official murders of black men. We have witnessed the suppression of voting rights. We have witnessed all of those things, which only says that if we're not vigilant about the advances that we make in race, it will be turned around and turned back. Palestinians are still fighting for basic human rights. And when they accomplish that, when they win that, they're still going to need to be vigilant around maintaining that. Again, black folks cannot lead the struggle of Palestinian rights and dignity, but black folks can join as supporters and in solidarity with Palestinians. And Palestinians have to call the shots and lead us in the way that we need to go. That's why I'm glad the United Church of Christ passed the BDS resolution that they passed. Again, because that came from civil Palestinian society that has directed folks in terms of what we need to embrace. And yet there are folks that say, well, I don't think that boycott BDS is going to work. Or that really is an aggressive act against Israel. You're really trying to destroy Israel. Up and says it to us, then we end up believing that somehow boycott, divestment, and sanctions are no good. I remember the Free South Africa movement. We were told that we were supporting communists. We were told that that boycott wouldn't work. That if you boycotted, you were going to hurt those South African blacks who were working in those industries, even though you had the ANC calling for it. Just like in Palestine, you got Palestinian organizations calling for it. Folks want to tell you, oh, you're going to injure, if you do that, the very people that you're trying to help. Well, isn't it interesting? The oppressor always going to tell you who you're going to hurt, right? Right? They're going to tell you who you're going to hurt because they want to protect their own position. But one thing that we knew is that it was a long struggle around the whole divestiture from South Africa. A long struggle. Year after year after year. People forget very often that when we started that, not many people wanted to hear about it. Most people thought that there was nothing wrong. Again, because people don't talk about race. I went to seminary. And in seminary, I got in trouble with the president of the seminary often because I didn't go to worship service. And finally, he got on my last nerve, so I had to go to worship service. And I don't know what the Lord was doing, but I got to worship service, and all of a sudden, something was strange about it. I sat there for a few minutes, and I heard the call to worship that said that we came to a land when it was just barbaric. And we caused the rivers to flow and the gardens to grow. We brought civilization and education. Well, those were white South Africans leading the service, of all the services for me to walk in. Obviously, I had to leave. And I went around and also rounded up all the people of color. And even the ones who didn't want to leave, I shamed them into leaving. And so we stood out in the hallway and we caucused. And then when we went back in the service, we lined around the wall and waited for them to say their benediction. And then we said, you had your say, now we're going to have our say. That's what people are trying to do. The media has had its say. It's time we have our say. Congress has had its say. It's time we have our say. Netanyahu has had his say. It's time we have our say. The Knesset has had its say. It's time we have our say as well. And that comes down to this, brothers and sisters. Are you ready to organize? I mean, are you really ready to organize? Somebody tell me yes. Yes. Somebody tell me yes. Are you ready to organize? Yes. And you know, that doesn't mean that we sit in a sanctuary year after year and we know each other in that sanctuary because we've been here year after year. Right? Organizing means that you go out, you round up, you bring in those who have not heard, you educate those who need to be educated, you mobilize those who need to be mobilized, you begin to move your agenda forward, and you see some fresh and new faces in the place, folks with energy, hopefully some of them young revolutionary folks that are ready to burn down the world if necessary, but they're not going to be relegated back to a place of submissiveness. Are you ready to organize? That's the question, and that's the reality. Because one of the things that I know is that we get out there and we don't want to talk about Palestine. Why? Because we might upset one of our friends. So we dance all around the subject because we got a friend that we know that is Zionist in their perspective, so we don't want to bring up the issue of Palestine. I don't know what kind of friendship that is. If you can't talk about issues and if you can't bore down to the truth, I don't know what that is. And so I'm going to say to you right now, one of the ways in which you organize is you bring up the dynamics of Palestine wherever you are, with whoever you're with. You're going out to dinner with somebody, when you say grace, add a little Palestinian reality in it. When you get ready to kiss your date, say to your date that night, say, what is your position on Palestine before I can kiss you? Right? I mean, in other words, what I'm saying is get out there and you make people come to the reality that something is wrong. The media is not going to do it. We're going to have to be the ones to do it. Obama is not going to do it. He's within a structure that doesn't allow his voice to do it, even if he believes it. The issue becomes we got to be the prophets, the preachers, the teachers, the organizers in the midst. And we got to have the courage to talk about the issues. We got to have the courage to find out, do we actually have any friends at all? If y'all understand what I'm talking about, I'm saying that we need to put ourselves out there. It's no longer any good just to feel self-righteous unto ourselves. I'm going to use a word, I'll say every liberal feels that way. Every liberal feels self-righteous. That they've done the right thing, they've been good, right? They've protected the environment, right? They've thought the correct things about race and racism, all of that type of stuff. But it's not about your individualism. It's about us collectively changing some realities. It's not about your own comfort. It's about us going into some places where we are uncomfortable. It's got to be up to us where we have the courage to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. We got to have the ability to go forth and do that. It is up to us of whether we're going to be the preachers and teachers. You see, reality is that race and racism exists because we are silent. We're silent. We're silent. We're silent. We still let our friends tell a little racist joke. We still receive the email from our friends that's a little tinged with racism, and we don't chastise them. See, we allow the situation to continue. And what I'm saying to us right now is that in the Palestinian struggle, we all become anti-racist. We all become anti-racist. That means that we got to attack some things, change some paradigms, speak some truths, educate ourselves about some history, go into our churches and say to the pastor, "Excuse me, preacher, where do you stand on the issue of Palestine?" I know that some of us don't want to do that because we're afraid that we might get the wrong answer from the preacher. But we need to go and we make those places where people are saying, "Well, why are you bringing up politics?" You know how folks are. "Why are you bringing that up on Thanksgiving dinner?" Well, if you want to give thanks, that's where you bring it up at. If you want to give real thanks, find out where your family is. Find out where your neighbors are. Find out where the deacon board, the elders are. Find out where the preacher is. Push the preacher if necessary. Push the elder board, the deacon board. Push your family if necessary. But the sisters and brothers, we need to break the silence. And in breaking the silence, we really stand with Palestinian people in their struggle. In their struggle. Because one of the things in making the neighborhood safe for Israel, we have basically destroyed that whole region of the world. War after war after war after war. Isn't it mighty funny that you can be the enemy of ISIL, but you and ISIL and the European Union are on the same side trying to get rid of Assad? Doesn't that sound strange? But I guess, folks, strange bedfellows, folks, right? But again, I'm just pointing out. I was on a show the other day. We were talking about Syrian refugees, behind all the political hype that they shouldn't come to the United States, they might endanger us, et cetera, and they had all types of folks. I was debating on a panel, and I had to remind them, because everybody seems to forget the history. And I said to them, you broke it. You broke it, and therefore you got a moral responsibility to open your arms. You broke it. When you went into a preemptive war and you began to topple government after government, you broke it. Let's not forget the history, how all this came into being. It was out of our own insanity and out of our own greed and out of our own sense of violence that we've continued to carry on and destroy the world and try to make the world in our own image again, another racist paradigm. Allow people to be themselves. You bring yourself back home and maybe build some schools and bring yourself back home and take that money and get rid of the prison systems and put some investment in human beings so that people get training and people have jobs and communities are built up. That's up to us as well to redirect the money from war towards peace. It's up to us to make the difference. Let's begin to break down and tear up this racist paradigm that exists. And let us decide to get off the plantation once and for all. Finally, the thing I want to say is that we've been marching around calling out Black Lives Matter. And just think about it. As we put up, and churches put up Black Lives Matter, somebody usually comes along in the middle of the night and scratches out the black and puts in the all. Because Black Lives Matter is a political pronunciation in a world where black lives don't matter. And it obviously challenges the framework and the paradigm. It challenges folk to understand the history of this country, the history of this world, when we declare that black lives matter. But the other thing that happens in Black Lives Matter, in that proclamation, we're telling ourselves that we matter, because the society has conditioned us to believe that we do not matter. have conditioned us to believe that, yes, we should fill up the jails, have conditioned us to believe that our schools don't have to teach, have conditioned us to believe all kinds of things so that we do not have the expectation that everybody else has. So when we say Black Lives Matter, it's also an affirmation. Affirmation. Black Lives Matter, but I got news for you. I understand at the same time that I call out Black Lives Matter as a political proclamation to the world and as an internal affirmation, I'm also standing here and able to say Palestinian lives matter as well. Palestinian lives matter. Everybody who's been struggling, their lives matter. The oppressed of this world, their lives matter. And sisters and brothers, we continue to march along in solidarity until we tear down the walls of white supremacy, that we tear down the walls of colonialism, and we allow the people of the world to be free. God bless you and thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bless you.